this is going to be a bit more of a conversational video. It's not going to have like a distinct start, middle, end. It's going to be more of a sort of long, rambly one, discussing the context of today's heavyweight division and a few thoughts I have on it. So if that's not for you, you know what to do. If you cut off now, you'll have only wasted 25 seconds of your life. For those who care to stick with me, it will go on a little bit longer than that. Let me start by taking you back to the new year. Now, I am not sure I ever expressed this sentiment in a video, but I'm going to take you to what I would have said if I'd done a video of this nature in the new year. And I'm going to tell you how my feelings towards the subject has changed in the start of 2018. The heavyweight division. You know, I watch a lot of Dwyer's content. Dwyer uses the phrase of the man. He uses the phrase of you've got a heavyweight champion and then there's everyone else. So let's start by talking about the man. You know, as I've started this YouTube channel and as it's been growing and, you know, as I've been watching boxing intently, the man in the heavyweight division, for me, has been Wladimir Klitschko. Conclusively, Wladimir Klitschko, during the time that I've been enjoying this sport, soundly beat David Haye. He soundly beat Alexander Povetkin. He soundly beat Kubrat Pulev. He soundly beat Tony Thompson. You know, there'll be others as well who don't instantly spring to my mind because his reign was so long. You know, Wladimir Klitschko, very, very, very much the man. Then along came Tyson Fury, and with his breakout victory over Wladimir Klitschko, quite quickly in my head, Tyson Fury became the man. You know, he became the man by beating the previous man. Now, subsequent to the Tyson Fury situation, the waters have become somewhat muddied because the belts became fragmented and there were various people in the division who held different versions of the title and considered themselves the man. But what I would say is privately, and again, I'm not clear if I ever stated this expressly on YouTube, but privately, my opinion would have been that you had Anthony Joshua, you had Deontay Wilder, and then you had a gap. I often talk about the different layers of heavyweights. I say you have, I think I said this in a video last week, you have your top tier, your AJs, your Wilders, your Parkers, then you have a bit of a gap, you've got your Dillian Whites, your Jarrell Millers, then you have a bit of a gap, and you know, you've got your Brian Jenningses, your Carlos Takams, etc., etc. So, I guess privately, I believed there was a top five, and within that top five, there was a distinct top two. You know, I predicted that Anthony Joshua would beat Joseph Parker clearly. I predicted that Deontay Wilder would beat Luis Ortiz clearly. But I believe that that top five was Joshua and Wilder, who were 1 and 2. And then Povetkin, Joseph Parker, and Luis Ortiz. You know, that would have been a sort of rough top five. And in my head, I kind of had Wilder, Joshua, quite considerable gap, Povetkin, Ortiz, Parker, quite considerable gap, and then you can start talking about your Dillian Whites, you know, those sort of guys. In my head, the lines have now blurred. In my head, the gaps today, April 2018, are less established. There is less of a significant difference between those different groups of heavyweights that I'm talking about. I think Anthony Joshua beat Joseph Parker clearly. I said in my post-fight video that I scored it 9 rounds to 3, and I stick with that scoring. But what I will acknowledge is that there is a substantial group of people who believe the fight was very, very competitive. People I respect, people with solid opinions in boxing. And I'm not talking about one individual here. I'm talking about a vocal minority who believed that the fight was very close, that the fight was very competitive, that the fight had multiple swing rounds, that maybe there wasn't too much of a gap between the two guys, that maybe the judges' scorecards were miles off. You know, there is a vocal minority of people who believe this. Now, not all of this minority are saying that Joseph Parker deserved to win. Not all of this minority are saying that the fight was a draw. But I would say a lot of the minority are actually saying, when you factor in how low volume the fight is, when you factor in how many swing rounds there were, this was actually a fight that could have been a hell of a lot closer than the differences the judges had. Now, as I say, I personally scored a fight 9 rounds to 3. That's how I see it. Clear and obvious on my card for Joshua. But I'll acknowledge that this is the fight that has caused controversy, and it's actually surprised me how much controversy it has caused. And I'll acknowledge that there are a substantial proportion of boxing fans who see this fight differently to how I see it. Regardless, this is 2 fights in a row where Joshua's opponent has not been laid out, sprawled on the floor. This is 2 fights in a row where Joshua's had awkward moments, where he hasn't looked as explosive, as invincible, as devastating as we've seen at different points of his career. Now, you could make the statement, perhaps that's because the level of opposition has been increasing. And maybe there's some truth in that. You know, Joseph Parker, Carlos Takam are very, very solid level opponents. But to be honest, it surprised me that Joshua was facing the kind of challenges in these fights that, frankly, I didn't expect to see. I was surprised how low volume Joshua was in this fight. I was surprised how little he threw that right hand. I found his movement at times awkward. I didn't think his timing was as on point as it's been at previous points in his career. I found his work on the back foot when Parker came forward very, very concerning indeed. And I've always thought Joshua was a beatable fighter. You know, I've never been one of these channels who's elected him as the next version of Muhammad Ali and say that he can't be beaten. But what I would say is, in my humble opinion, looking at Anthony Joshua now, I probably see him as a more beatable fighter than I did a year ago. Now let's turn to Deontay Wilder for a second. Wilder's another guy who, at his best, has been a fast, explosive, devastating puncher. But even the most ardent Wilder fan would have to acknowledge that he was in all sorts of bother in his last fight. All sorts of bother in his last fight. And that he came within a whisker of being stopped in that fight. Again, this is in no way to discredit Wilder. He deserves huge props for going through those difficulties and for winning against a top opponent, winning by knockout, winning in style by knockout, despite facing those difficulties. But you do have to ask yourself, you know, looking at Deontay Wilder in that fight, is he going to be very, very vulnerable consistently against the elite of the heavyweight division? You know, Luis Ortiz himself is a guy who, you know, is of, how best to phrase this, is of a certain vintage. In my opinion, small given the context of today's heavyweight division. For me, not a 12-round fighter. Not a 15-round fighter like James DeGale, but not even a 12-round fighter. You know, enough reason to doubt Luis Ortiz at this stage of his career. You got Alexander Povetkin, the long-standing top heavyweight. The guy who was the long-standing top heavyweight prior to Joshua, prior to Wilder. You know, him looking more vulnerable than ever. Knocked down by David Price on unsteady legs for a round afterwards. looking small, looking old, maybe not the same fighter these days as he was in years gone by, for contributing factors. You know, Joseph Parker, you know, the great hope of the New Zealand boxing community. A guy who would need to make very substantial adjustments, for my money, to be victorious against a Joshua type fighter again. But a guy who's been unable to make those adjustments so far in his career. A guy who was in highly competitive fights with the likes of Carlos Takam, Andy Ruiz, Hughie Fury. You know, fights like that that were extremely controversial, that there were vocal minorities, and in certain cases not even minorities, of people, you know, who felt that maybe Parker got a lucky decision in those fights. So what I'm getting at is where we're at with the heavyweight division is that established top 5. To me, all of them look beatable. There's not a fighter among them now who I can say, that is the man. Joshua's definitely the consensus number 1. In beating Parker, in beating Vladimir Klitschko, for me, he clearly has the best resume. Throw in Dillian Whyte as well. You know, Joshua beating Whyte, he beat Brazil. You know, he has the best resume for me. And obviously, you know, I think Joshua's clearly the number 1. But what I would say is they all look beatable. None of these fighters to me look like guys who will go through their next 10 fights without taking an L. You know, I expect to see these guys start fighting each other and start losing to each other, to be honest. I don't think Wilder's going to retire undefeated. I don't think Joshua's going to retire undefeated. And I think it's very possible that the likes of a Parker, that the likes of a Luis Ortiz could well lose again. You know, could well lose again. Unless they address some of the things that went wrong in their previous fights. That's just my take. And I actually think the gap between the top 5 and the next layer of heavyweights is a lot smaller than I previously perceived it to be. Dillian Whyte is someone who I had previously written off, if you like. Dillian Whyte is someone I viewed as too technically flawed, too defensively inept to have success in the heavyweight division at the elite level. But now we've seen him put in a career high performance against Lucas Browne. Yes, Lucas Browne was woeful, but for me, Dillian looked sharper than I've seen him before. He looked faster than I've seen him before. He was putting combinations better than I've seen him before. Yeah, I was impressed. Would I pick Dillian Whyte to beat one of the heavyweight elite? No, I wouldn't. But I don't think it's out of the question he could pull an upset. Hughie Fury. We're not going to revisit the Hughie Fury-Joseph Parker fight because that was controversial enough and caused enough upset in the boxing community. But let's just say, regardless of whether you like Hughie Fury's style or not, he poses a real test to a lot of these fighters with the attributes he brings, and he's someone who's going to be on very much on that comeback trail in 2018 and 2019. And yeah, however you view that Joseph Parker fight, let's agree that he was extremely competitive in a fight with one of the top level boxers as a minimum. You know, I'm sure we can all agree that. Hughie Fury's only 23, 24, something like that. There's huge scope for improvement and learning from him. Jarrell Miller, undefeated, big as hell, hard punching, supposedly has a chin of steel. Again, brings a style, brings a pressure, brings a size to the division that in many ways isn't comparable to anyone else in the top of the heavyweight list, you know. And then you've got guys like Brian Jennings, Carlos Takam, Kubrat Pulev, you know, long-standing operators within the heavyweight division. Would you pick any of these guys to go on and unify titles and win the belts? Probably not. Maybe they're too old. Maybe they haven't had the fights that they've needed at this point in their career. But you look at some of the problems that movement and boxing and range has caused these top level heavyweights, and then you've got to ask yourself, a 6'5" guy like Kubrat Pulev, with the jab of Kubrat Pulev, with the amateur pedigree of Kubrat Pulev, could he cause them problems? Could he cause more problems than a Carlos Takam? Absolutely. On his day, there's the potential. I guess what I'm saying is, for me, the scene as I see it is now blurred. It's now less defined. And who can forget, for want of a better term, the ghost of the heavyweight division, which is Tyson Fury. You know, I haven't spent too long on this channel talking about the return of Tyson Fury and speculating as to what that will look like. Because as I've always said, you know, I believe it when I see it. So I'm not going to spend the next 10 minutes devoted to talking about how great Tyson Fury could be. Because he needs to come back and do something. But he's a man who, you know, is still a young man for the context of this division. He's a man who could easily be in the mix in the next 3 or 4 months if things fall into question. What I will say, as a Tyson Fury fan, I have huge doubt whether we will ever see the same Tyson Fury as we saw from that night with Vladimir Klitschko. The period of time out of the ring, the health problems, physical and mental, some of the surrounding scandal of drugs, both recreational and performance enhancing. You know, I think there are a lot of risk factors in the return of Tyson Fury to the ring, and I, for one, would not be sitting there ready to anoint him as the #1 heavyweight the second he comes back, even if he looks good, because there's a hell of a lot of questions to answer from a Fury perspective. But obviously he's a fascinating addition to the mix if he does return. And then you've got the guys who are coming through, the guys who aren't yet on the scene. You've got guys like Joe Joyce. Now, yes, Joe Joyce is only 3-0, but they're talking about him fighting Chisora in his next fight. You know, if he were to do that successfully, you'd already be considering Joe Joyce as top 20, top 25 in the heavyweight division at 4-0. And given that he's now 32, he'll be moved swiftly. Young guys coming through. Daniel Dubois, Tony Yoka, Nathan Gorman, Filip Hrgovic. All names that you're going to hear a lot of in the next year or two. People will have their favourites. People will say Dubois is the next guy. People will say Hrgovic is the next guy. Pay us your money, take your choice. But what I will say is, it's certainly very much within the realms of possibility that some of those guys will be knocking on the door in the next year, 18 months. And the way the division's stacked up at present, it wouldn't surprise me if someone comes from left field and someone really, really unexpected becomes the #1. Yeah, I'm not going to sit here now and tell you that Joe Joyce and that Nathan Gorman are the guys who are going to knock Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder off their pedestals. But these are guys with real pedigree, and I'm liking what I'm seeing in them. And clearly, very, very, very early stages. Clearly guys who are going to need to be stepped up, answer a load of questions. But there are guys with interesting profiles who, if things fall nicely for them, could be in a position to at least ask the question, you know, before too much time goes. And frankly, there isn't a single fighter in the division right now that I could say I'd find it hard to see them losing. There isn't a single fighter in the division right now who I would pick with certainty above all others. Clearly, Joshua would start as a bookmaking favourite against every fighter in the division right now, because of his name, his celebrity, the fact he's got the belts, his image, his resume and his track record being the key one. But could I honestly tell you, if AJ was fighting Wilder, or if AJ was fighting Povetkin, that I couldn't see him losing? Absolutely not. The frailties are there. And this isn't an AJ hating video. You know, could I see Dillian Whyte losing against those guys? Could I see Jarrell Miller losing against these guys? Could I see Hughie Fury losing against those guys? Absolutely. You know, I see the heavyweight division at the minute as much of a muchness. I see it as a hard division to rate, a hard division to have certainty about. And I hope that we will get clarity in the next year or two for how things stock up. But right now, I think the cracks have shown in the majority of the top 5. And I think it's become a more open division with a less clear elite and a less clear gap between the levels. You know, just my thoughts. As I said at the start of the video, this one didn't have a distinct start, middle and end. It was going to be a ramble. But what am I going to take from this? What I'm going to take from this is, in future, in the next 6 months, will I be writing off a Kubrat Pulev, a Jarrell Miller, a returning Bryant Jennings, a returning Andy Ruiz, a returning Hughie Fury, a Joe Joyce stepping up in levels? Will I be writing off that profile of fighter? Absolutely not. You know, if you told me that Kubrat Pulev was fighting a Wilder or a Parker, would I have written him off 5-6 months ago? Very possibly. You know, could a Kubrat Pulev or an unfashionable fighter like that, a Bryant Jennings, you know, could a name like that upset one of the big boys? Could they go and beat a Povetkin? Could they go and beat a, you know, a Parker? I'm not saying I'd pick them to do it. I'm not telling you they will do it. But I'm seeing it as infinitely possible. I see the heavyweight division as a lot more open. I still see Josh Stewart and Wilder as the top boys in that order. But, as I say, far less of a gap. Give me your take. Comments in the section below as always. If you've enjoyed the content, please subscribe. Please hit the thumbs up button. Let me know your thoughts, guys. Thanks for tuning in.